I know I usually talk about cartoons here, but here's a little secret you might not know about me. I fucking love Spider-Man. He is easily my favorite superhero, and these days one of the few that gets me truly excited anymore. And obviously there is a ton of excitement all around for the upcoming Spider-Man No Way Home, in large part because of the major rumors surrounding it. Spoiler warning if you have somehow been living under a digital rock and emerged today just to watch this video, but here's the deal, it sounds like we're gonna get to see all 3 generations of Spiders-Man in Spider-Man No Way Home. And this little rumor has unfortunately 100% overshadowed the film itself, but it's also created a ton of renewed interest in the previous Spider-Man movies, as well as renewed debate about which iteration of the character is actually the best. Well, as the title might suggest, I'm here to tell you this. They're all great. Every single one of them.
Gonna cry?
All 3 iterations of live-action Spider-Man we've gotten on the big screen are completely valid, and today I'm going to talk in depth about why I love all 3. Now, don't get it twisted or caught in a web. I don't love every Spider-Man movie, and you might hear me talk a little bit of shit in this video, which is a little unusual for this channel, but we'll see how it goes. So let's swing into the Spider-Verse.
He stole that guy's pizza!
I actually grew up on the 90s Spider-Man cartoon, which to this day is one of my favorite iterations of the character, but seeing the first of the Raimi trilogy back in 2002 is still a cherished memory of mine. X-Men a couple years prior was pretty huge as well, finally getting to see the comic characters I loved on the big screen, but Spider-Man was different, and not only for comic book fans, because the entire world was seemingly hyped on Spidey, and for good reason. Sam Raimi's first entry in the Spider-Man franchise is an incredible introduction to the character, and for most people, probably the definitive version of the character, even if he isn't one-to-one with his comic book counterpart. High school Peter is a total dork, but also suffers from wild social anxiety. I mean, my dude, how do you fumble this hard?
Hey, you have blue eyes. I didn't notice without your glasses. You just get contacts?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Dude, come on. I think one of this film's greatest strengths is how well it's paced. By the 10-minute mark, Pete's already been bitten by the spider. It introduces the character and his place in the world immediately and gets right into the inciting incident. The world of the Raimi trilogy is definitely a little campy, but it's also very pure, and Peter is at the heart of that. He's a good kid trying to do the right thing, and when he does the wrong thing, he pays for it dearly. But he also encapsulates what I think is most important about Peter Parker. He's just some kid who got bit by a spider. He's got such a relatable everyman quality. It makes you care about him, and it makes you cheer for him. But the best work they've done with the character is in the sequel, Spider-Man 2, a perfect superhero film.
You're fired.
The sequel takes the themes and messages of the first film and hones in on them in the smartest way. This is With Great Power Comes Great Responsibility, the movie. And it showcases why cheering for Peter feels so right.
They love me.
The entire movie is about how being Spider-Man kind of sucks. Every single aspect of Peter's life completely collapses because of his responsibilities as Spider-Man. His grades fall, he doesn't see his friends anymore, he can't be with Mary Jane, he loses his job, he can't pay his rent.
Where's my money?
It's just a barrage of pain. The scene that exemplifies this is the big gala where he's taking photos for the Bugle. Even down to the little tiny beats in this scene, it's all about how literally nothing goes Peter's way. He can't even get an appetizer or a drink. And it just gets worse and worse. Harry chastises him for taking photos of Spider-Man.
Huh?
MJ is there dating John Jameson, who the gala is honoring. In perfect succession, Peter fails miserably trying to get through to MJ. Harry makes a public scene assaulting Peter for his connection with Spidey, and then Jameson announces that Mary Jane has agreed to marry him. And to add insult to injury, Peter has to take photos of the happy couple. It's just pain the scene. And all of the problems here stem from Peter being Spider-Man. He only took the job because he's desperate for cash. Harry hates him for protecting Spidey. He can't be with Mary Jane because of his responsibility. And then he just stops. He decides, hey, if I'm miserable, then I shouldn't be Spider-Man. And you know what? It works. He is happy for the first time seemingly in years. His grades get better. He connects with MJ. The world stops pushing him around. But even though he's actually happy, that nagging responsibility eats away at Peter Parker. He knows he has the power to help people, and he isn't doing it. And that is the core of Peter Parker. One of my favorite scenes in this movie is where Peter, without his abilities, rescues this little girl from a fire. It's heroic and it's selfless, but when he learns that somebody else died in the fire, he takes that guilt on himself. He blames himself. He knows He has to be Spider-Man. It's his responsibility. To further cement this, even the film's villain has an arc that echoes this sentiment. Early in the movie, Octavius talks to Pete about intelligence, how it's a privilege that has to be used for the good of mankind. Basically, with great power, in other terminology. He obviously loses his way over the course of the film, but the thing that brings him back around is Peter himself, echoing the sentiment after learning it unequivocally himself.
You once spoke to me about intelligence. A privilege.
Spider-Man 2 is a perfect film, and I truly adore it. But most importantly, it showcases Peter Parker in his most challenging personal journey. But all good things have to come to an end, right? And that end was actually the end of Spider-Man 2, because holy shit does Spider-Man 3 stumble hard on the landing.
I'm gonna put some dirt in your eye.
This might be the most shit you ever hear me talk on this channel ever, because Spider-Man 3 is the only Spider-Man movie that actually makes me angry. But let's start with my absolute #1 frustration with this film. Who the hell are you, and what have you done with Peter Parker? Because the Peter Parker in Spider-Man 3 sucks. And I'm not talking about emo dance boy. I mean before all of this. Peter Parker sucks, and it makes absolutely no sense as a follow-up to the character we saw at the end of Spider-Man 2. Spider-Man is so preoccupied over the previous film about MJ's well-being. He is completely devoted to her.
If you got hurt, I could never forgive myself.
And you're trying to tell me that this guy would do the Spider-Man kiss with another girl in front of Mary Jane? That's straight up sadistic behavior. And even worse, Peter is absolutely 100% oblivious to the fact that this might upset Mary Jane.
Who was kissing her? Spider-Man or Peter?
What do you mean?
I'm sorry, I don't buy it. This is not the same character. Maybe this should have been the beginning of the Clone Saga, because this is not Peter Parker. And look, I know that the idea here is that the fame of being Spider-Man has now gone to Peter's head, which is a fine idea, but I don't believe for a second that this character that we saw in Spider-Man 2 would so quickly discard the feelings of the woman he's been in love with for his entire life this drastically. I think there's definitely some narrative opportunity with that idea. But here's the kicker, they don't actually do anything with it, because while this is the crux of the conflict in the first act of the film, the second act shifts entirely into a story about revenge and letting our hate overtake us, which again, not a bad idea, especially in a Venom/symbiote story, but it's entirely disconnected from the first act. And no, I don't hate everything about Spider-Man 3. There are some really strong ideas in there, and a couple of these action sequences are really dynamic. The scene where Peter is fighting Harry while trying to protect Aunt May's engagement ring is incredibly well executed. I also love the introduction of Sandman. That scene is rife with emotion, which is really impressive since there's absolutely no dialogue. There are some really great parts of the final battle sequence too, but for some reason they just keep cutting to this news report that just reiterates exactly what we just saw. I feel like this is them trying to recreate the whole New York is a character thing that worked well in Spidey 1 and 2, but it's so forced and poorly executed here.
I don't know how we can take any more.
I really like the casting of Bryce Dallas Howard as Gwen Stacy, even though I think the way they used her simply as a wedge to drive between Peter and MJ does the character a disservice. I also love Black Suit Spidey, and even love Venom's design in this movie. It's just a shame that they continually hide it by making Topher Grace's face emerge from the symbiote. But I genuinely like this design more than what they've done with the Tom Hardy films. It just feels more tactile and less digital. Speaking of character design frustrations, it really bums me out that they didn't just let Harry wear a goblin mask. This totally rad extreme sports look just does not do it for me, even if some of these sequences work well. I just really would have loved a classic glider and for Harry to truly take up the mantle of Green Goblin. Okay, I promise I'm in the home stretch here. This movie just makes me really mad. But why on earth was it so obsessed with backtracking everything from the first two movies in so many different ways? Mary Jane and Peter are finally together. Let's immediately tear them apart. Harry found out Peter is Spider-Man. Let's immediately give him amnesia. We knew all about Uncle Ben's killer. Now we're retconning it so that it was somebody else. Oh, and now Bernard cleaned Norman Osborn's wounds and could explicitly tell that the wounds were self-inflicted? He just kept it a secret for years despite seeing Harry absolutely obsess over finding Spider-Man? Truly embarrassing stuff. This movie takes half a step forward and 5 giant steps back.
You want forgiveness? Get religion.
All right, let's move on because there are so many Spider-Man movies to cover. After the disaster that was Spider-Man 3 and failing to crack the story on Spider-Man 4, Sony decided to reboot with Andrew Garfield taking over as Peter Parker and Mark Webb directing. Cannot overstate how much I love that a guy named Webb directed Spider-Man movies. So it feels like this duology is sort of the black sheep of the franchise, but there are things I love about these movies, even if they aren't my favorite iteration. First off, the casting is incredible. I would argue the best in the franchise. Andrew Garfield is without a doubt the best actor to ever wear the mask, and Emma Stone is basically the co-lead as Gwen Stacy, which gives them a different feeling than either the Raimi or MCU flicks. And Martin Sheen as Uncle Ben, are you kidding me? Literal perfection. Sally Field is amazing as Aunt May, Dennis Leary makes a great Captain Stacy, and so many of these actors just have excellent chemistry, especially Andrew Garfield and Emma Stone, and truly the absolute heart of these two films is Peter and Gwen's relationship. But I even like some of the ways they shifted this Peter Parker to stand as his own iteration while still maintaining the core of the character. I regularly hear that this Peter Parker is too damn cool, and sure, he's not anything close to the dork we saw in the Raimi trilogy, but I think the important thing here is that Peter is still an outsider. Yeah, he's not the one being picked on by Flash Thompson anymore, but he is ostracized for standing up for the dork who is being picked on. He's this shy skater boy who still doesn't fit in at his school, just not in your standard jock versus nerd stereotype. And when this movie is just redoing the same origin we saw 10 years earlier in the first Raimi movie, I think it was incredibly smart to inject a different personality into that execution. And Andrew Garfield makes a great Spider-Man. Even if you think his Peter is a bit too cool, his look and his attitude while webbing up baddies is pure Spidey. Just a total smartass.
Is that a real knife? Yes, it's a real knife.
My weakness, it's small knives.
But he's also caring and gentle when he needs to be. The bridge scene where he saves the kid from this burning car is perfect. Taking off his mask, showing him he's actually a person, encouraging him to climb to safety. This is just great stuff, and seeing that connection Spidey has to the people he saves goes such a long way. I do think that one area these films undoubtedly falter in is the villain category. We'll get to the sequel in a bit, but for this first film, Lizard is just incredibly underwhelming. And why does he have a lab in the sewer? The Lizard himself just has so little personality, which is especially disappointing coming off of some of the greatest supervillain performances of all time in the first two Raimi films. It's hard not to love this fight sequence at school, but overall the Lizard is just kind of a dud. I do think this film looks great though. In fact, I actually watched this in 3D for the first time recently, and let me tell you, the swinging sequences are breathtaking in that format. It really makes you appreciate the detail that went into the choreography there. While The Amazing Spider-Man 1 is maybe a little redundant, I think it does not get enough credit for some of the things it does incredibly well. It's a strong take on the origin, and I think it's injected with a ton of emotionality that few other Spider-Man movies have lived up to. Ending the film with Uncle Ben's voicemail to Peter just destroys me. There's a lot to like in this one. So let's move on to the sequel, which to many is the absolute worst Spider-Man movie that Hollywood has to offer. My feelings are a bit more complicated because while there are aspects of this film that I absolutely loathe, I also think it manages to do some things better than any other Spider-Man film before or after it. It totally doesn't get the credit it deserves for some of these things, and maybe that's understandable because the film's shortcomings really can be egregious. But let's talk about the things that I actually love about The Amazing Spider-Man 2. There's a tiny scene in the first act of the movie that I am obsessed with, where Spidey rescues this little kid, Jorge, from these bullies.
Did you make this?
Yeah.
This is a wind turbine. You made this?
This is why we love Peter Parker. He is a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, and seeing his actual connection to the people he saves, like the kid in the burning car in the last movie, it's just so gratifying to see.
What's your name?
Jorge.
Jorge? I'm Spider-Man.
This scene was also apparently Andrew Garfield's idea, so, you know, we stand a legend. I also think that Sally Field delivers arguably the best Aunt May moment in any Spidey film in this one. Not to shade Rosemary Harris, who absolutely rocks it in the Raimi trilogy, but the emotionality in this scene gets me every single time. When Aunt May discovers how far down the Richard Parker rabbit hole is Peter... That's a hard one to say. It's a little bit of a tongue twister. I got it. Hold on. When Aunt May discovers how far down the Richard Parker rabbit hole that Peter has fallen, she gets incredibly emotional.
You're my boy. As far as I'm concerned, you're my boy.
There's just amazing chemistry between Garfield and Field right here. You can really feel their love for each other. It works so well. And speaking of chemistry, Garfield and Stone's chemistry is undeniable, and it's on full display this entire movie. The Peter and Gwen story has me fully engaged every time I watch this series, and it's easily the best romance in a Spider-Man film. And Gwen is always portrayed as a partner in these movies, rather than a damsel in distress. Since she learns Peter is Spidey so early, it gives a whole new dynamic to their relationship that we didn't see between Peter and MJ in the Raimi movies. But the way this all culminates in The Amazing Spider-Man 2 is just a masterclass in heartbreak, because Holy shit. Coming hot off this cathartic, beautiful scene where Peter tells Gwen that she is his path and that he'll follow her to Europe for her scholarship, we get easily the most heartbreaking sequence in the entire Spider-Man franchise. I actually think this final Electro fight kinda rules, except the itsy bitsy spider bit, that sucked, but visually, I love this, and the fact that Gwen and Peter take him down together is a perfect way for their arcs in this film to close out. They overcome their fears about their relationship, set themselves on the same path, and then newly realigned, they take down the villain and save the city together. Because no matter what comes after this, they did still save the city together. But of course, this movie subverts this arc, because the big victory moment is interrupted by Dane DeHaan's Green Goblin, who I will talk more about later. I'm not done with him, but this sequence is just incredible. I don't think any sequence in any other Spider-Man film is this suspenseful as Peter tries to rescue Gwen from Goblin. And if you're aware of her story in the comics going into this movie, you're absolutely fearing the worst. Gwen Stacy's death in The Amazing Spider-Man 2 destroys me every single time. There is not any other Spider-Man movie that makes me feel this emotional. It is absolutely gut-wrenching and heartbreaking, and not just because it's a well-executed sequence, also because as a viewer, you have bought into this relationship so thoroughly. Their chemistry is undeniable, and their romance is the highlight of these films, and for it all to end this way is just devastating. Alright, so now let's talk about the things that are unquestionably awful about this film. I know a lot of you might expect me to talk about Electro here, but I actually don't hate Electro. I don't love Electro, but I like him. But what I do hate is the abomination that is Green Goblin.
God, I'm sorry. That's just not the answer we were looking for.
I have no idea what Dane DeHaan is trying to do with this character. I respect that he kind of took a big swing, but it's clear that it did not connect. But what's worse is this design. What on earth is happening here? Did y'all watch All That as a kid? It looks like Katrina Johnson's take on Ross Perot.
All I gotta do is think of a way to get rich, and folks love you too.
Do I even have to go on? It's just a travesty. I get that they were trying to differentiate from the last trilogy, but this was not the move. But the thing that I hate most about The Amazing Spider-Man 2 is how they resolve the plotline with Peter's parents. First off, this secret lab subway car that shows up when you use a special token is just an insane concept. The infrastructure required for this to be a thing is ridiculous. How the hell does this even exist? But more importantly, the revelation here to me is my biggest problem with the web version of Spider-Man. While I really like the idea that Richard Parker exemplified with great power comes great responsibility in the actions that led to his death, the reveal that he used his own DNA in his cross-species genetics experiments, to me, flies in the face of the core of Peter Parker. Because in this universe, it basically means that the only person who could have become Spider-Man is Peter Parker. It takes away from that everyman quality that I love about the character. It makes it feel like Peter was preordained, always destined to be Spidey, and not just a kid who was bit by a spider. It places more importance on the bloodline than the person, and I really think it devalues the character. Overall, the parental storyline in these films were a real miss. I get that you want to do something new with it, but they didn't add enough to the narrative to justify themselves, and obviously in the Amazing Spider-Man 2's case, it actively detracted from the narrative. I think overall this movie just tried to juggle way too many stories. You've got the Peter and Gwen romance, there's the Peter and Max superfan thing, the Peter and Harry old friend narrative that required a lot of legwork since they didn't set it up in the previous movie, and then of course Peter's parents storyline to wrap up. It's just too much, and half of those 4 storylines worked, and half of them didn't. The Amazing Spider-Man 2 has a lot of problems, and it can be a weird movie.
This is not it, Spider!
But I also cannot deny the heights of the film and the places it brought me emotionally. I really think overall that this film is undervalued. And as audiences and critics weren't huge fans of the film, this brings us to the most recent iteration of live-action Spidey, as Tom Holland enters the much more popular MCU. A lot of old school fans take issue with the MCU version, and that bums me out, because it feels like a lot of the detractors are mostly just very attached to the previous versions of Spider-Man, which I understand. I am too. But I think it's misguided to use those films as a measuring stick in regards to what a Spider-Man movie has to be. In my opinion, the MCU does an excellent job integrating Peter Parker into a world where superheroes have already been running around saving people for nearly his entire life. And I think this is an absolutely smart and valid way to portray the character going into the 3rd series of films. That isn't to say I don't have issues with some of the narratives. I do, and we'll get there. But at his core, this character is absolutely still Peter Parker, and the themes present in nearly all Spider-Man films still exist here. And if you think they don't, I'm not sure you're looking closely enough. Look, if your preference is a Spider-Man that is more disconnected from a larger universe, I respect and appreciate that preference. But to claim that this isn't actually Peter Parker in these movies, or even worse, to just boil him down to Iron Man Jr., is to really miss the point of these films. The reality is that if Peter Parker's childhood largely existed in a world where tons of other superheroes are not only running around, but even actively saving New York, the city in which he lives, he would absolutely look up to those characters. In fact, to place a 15-year-old Peter Parker in the MCU and not have him look up to the heroes he's seen his entire life would be completely disingenuous to the character.
It is I, Thor, son of Odin.
No. That's definitely not what we want to watch.
And again, if this isn't your preference, I get it. But it's the reality of placing this character in this type of a world. And I think they do a pretty great job doing that. Though, if I can go on a mini tangent rant here, let's talk about his introduction in Captain America Civil War. I absolutely love these scenes, especially his actual introduction and conversation with Tony. It exemplifies what Peter Parker is all about, great power and all that.
Look, when you can do the things that I can, but you don't, and then the bad things happen, they happen because of you.
That being said, can anybody explain to me how this makes any sense in the narrative of Captain America Civil War? The crux of the conflict of this film is that Tony Stark feels immense regret over the collateral damage caused by the Avengers and thinks there needs to be more accountability. The thing that brings him around on this idea is speaking to a mother whose son lost his life in Sokovia during Age of Ultron, cut down in the prime of his life. So why is Tony Stark within that same narrative recruiting a 15-year-old kid to fight superhumans? I'm sorry, but this makes no sense. I love Spidey's scenes in this movie, but that's really hard for me to wrap my head around. That being said, I quite like Spider-Man Homecoming and Far From Home, especially Homecoming, which does a great job showing Peter being your actual friendly neighborhood Spider-Man.
Okay, Spider-Man, don't flip. Yeah!
I just love seeing Spidey help people around Queens with lower stakes. It's really charming. Tom Holland nails Peter Parker too, and it's really nice to see a Peter who actually looks like he's in high school. We get a bit of high school in both other series, but I love that these movies are letting him actually just be a high schooler. But the core of these movies that's so important to the character is the idea that being Spider-Man is hard. Something that Spider-Man 2 obviously leaned into fully, but seeing Peter have to leave his friend and his crush at a party to do the hero thing, or abandon his classmates at the academic decathlon, or leave the homecoming dance after scoring a date with his crush, that's Spider-Man. Balancing the things you want to do with your responsibilities, and often losing out on the simple pleasures of life that most of us take for granted. That's Spider-Man. And in addition to this, they managed to tie Spidey into a larger narrative about living up to your own expectations in a world where superheroes are largely beloved. The way Homecoming showcases Peter's overzealousness in his attempts to live up to the heroes he himself looks up to is incredibly well executed. People really hate that Peter has a Stark-built suit in these films, but this is such a smart way to tie his journey into this larger world, and the Stark suit is a crutch that enables his own misguided mindset, which is why the final act of the film is perfect, as Peter manages to save the day without Stark tech. The scene where he's crushed under the warehouse always gets me emotional. Holland acts the hell out of it, and I love the way he hypes himself up to get out of there.
Come on, Spider-Man! Oh, come on, Spider-Man!
Without the use of gadgets or tech, it's just pure Spider-Man force of will. And Peter rescuing Vulture from his own near-death experience, that is 100% Peter Parker. There are aspects of this movie that I take slight issue with. I understand needing to change things up after the two previous iterations of the character, but they kind of borrowed a bunch of aspects of Miles Morales' setting for this version of Peter Parker. The sort of private science school in particular is just pulled right out of the Miles comics, but even just how Ned fits into the story as Peter's best friend. Phil Lord and Chris Miller, who produced Into the Spider-Verse, even said that they ended up cutting Miles' best friend Genki almost entirely out of the movie after seeing how they used that same dynamic for Peter and Ned in Homecoming. It's kind of a bummer that they took it from another character. But let's talk about Far From Home, because I think people have more issues with this one than they do Homecoming. Personally, I do have one major issue with this film, and it's a fundamental one. I absolutely hate the premise that Tony Stark would give a 15-year-old kid AI glasses that control war drones. That is just bonkers. I hate it. That being said, though I take issue with it fundamentally, I do think they executed this premise very well, and I think that this take on Mysterio is pure genius, with Jake Gyllenhaal easily being the highlight of the movie. But it's also another situation that really forces Peter to recognize that with great power comes great responsibility. After the events of the Avengers films, Peter is in a similar mindset that we saw his counterpart have back in Spider-Man 2.
You sent Nick Fury to voicemail?
Yeah.
You don't send Nick Fury to voicemail.
The Spider-Man superhero stuff has taken a toll on him, and all he wants is to go on a trip with his class, tell MJ how he feels about her, and have a nice, worry-free vacation. And while I don't love the plot device of these glasses, Peter tries to skirt that responsibility. He passes it off to Mysterio, and in doing so makes a huge mistake that he has to make right. There are massive consequences for Peter failing to take on the responsibility that comes with his power. Plus, in the wake of Tony Stark's death, Peter is grappling with the idea that he might need to take on more responsibility and live up to that hero he's looked up to. And this is a great Peter Parker storyline. Look, I also wish that they would mention Uncle Ben in these damn movies, but I don't think that the intention here is to make Tony Stark Peter's Uncle Ben. Peter was basically doing the with great power shtick when he met Tony. I think he looks up to Tony because in this world, he exemplifies that concept, especially after his self-sacrifice in Avengers Endgame. But I love how they handle this in-universe and on a metatextual level, because now without Iron Man, the most popular hero in the MCU is absolutely Spider-Man. So you've got this dual narrative where in the story, Peter has to grapple with the pressure of being called up to the superhero big leagues and fear being so closely compared with Iron Man. And metatextually, you've got a character who came into the picture in MCU Phase 3 and now has to take up the mantle of the most popular hero for us, the fans. It's a fun way to do the story. But what truly works is that in the end, it's a story about Peter realizing that he doesn't have to be Tony Stark, he just has to take on the responsibility. Peter is his own hero. He builds himself a new suit. He doesn't use the one that was designed by Tony, and we even see him think critically about what tools he'll need to take down Mysterio, implementing and utilizing these shockwebs that take out the drones. But most importantly, Peter doesn't save the day with those drone glasses that I had a problem with, or even with any tech from his own suit. He saves the day with his spider sense, something that only Spider-Man has, something that is purely Peter. In spite of the overwhelming odds and his own overwhelming fear, Peter takes on the responsibility that is thrust upon him, rescues countless people, and does it in a way that only Spider-Man can. He isn't trying to be Iron Man, he's succeeding in being Spider-Man. So at the end of the day, the core of Peter Parker is present in every iteration we've seen. We all have preferences for how we like these stories to be told, but Tobey Maguire, Andrew Garfield, and Tom Holland, they're all valid and great Spider-Man, which is one reason I'm so eager to see No Way Home, because it not only feels like a film that will grapple with Peter Parker himself, but the legacy Peter Parker holds, both in this multiverse and in our own universe as an audience. It's a movie that seems to be embracing Peter Parker as a character in the grandest way possible. I don't need No Way Home to be the best Spider-Man movie. I just need it to be a Peter Parker movie. But I also adore that this film is aiming to be a love letter to what came before, bringing all of these classic villains back and potentially utilizing the former two Spider-Men. It's a great way to celebrate the franchise and character in an inclusive and loving way. Kevin Feige talked about this himself.
It's a celebration of what's come before, and in a fandom that can often be toxic for no reason and pit franchises and studios and characters against each other. This movie is all about a celebration and unity and dare I say, love.
I think this attitude is really important because the older the Spider-Man fandom gets and the more options the fans have in terms of how to enjoy this character, the seemingly more angry and opinionated those fans get. And that toxicity is such a massive bummer. The fact that this movie is potentially going to appreciate every version of Spider-Man is such a nice message to the fans. A message to cool it with the toxic infighting and just enjoy what you enjoy. A movie about Spider-Man shouldn't break you, especially when there are now 9 of those movies. Enjoy the ones you enjoy, and if you don't love them all, that's okay. But they're just movies, guys. And I'm really excited to see if they can pull this massive feat off. And hey, if you liked my rants and rambles about my favorite superhero, let me know. Maybe I'll make a No Way Home video after I've seen it. Although there's going to be a lot of those. You might be sick of them by the time I get around to it. Alright, so to close out the video, I'm going to just do the obligatory Spider-Man film ranking, starting with the worst. Number 7, Spider-Man 3. Number 6, The Amazing Spider-Man 2. Number 5, The Amazing Spider-Man. Number 4, Spider-Man Far From Home. Number 3, Spider-Man Homecoming. Number 2, Spider-Man. And number 1, Spider-Man 2. That being said, Spider-Verse is better than all of them. Bye!
Challenge!